They thought she was just a helpless widow, but they were wrong. When danger comes for her family, she doesn't wait to be saved. She becomes the storm itself. This channel is dedicated to powerful Western stories about courage, love, motherhood, and the strength of the human spirit. This story teaches us, no matter how broken your past is, you still have the power to rewrite your future. If you believe in stories that inspire, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.
The sky didn't just rain. It violently tried to wash the Texas Valley off the map. Cora Bennett leaned her slight weight against the heavy barn door, her boots slipping in the churning mud. Thunder cracked, a sound like a mountain splitting in two, and vibrated through the soles of her worn boots. She managed to shove the latch into place, locking her half-starved mare inside, and leaned her forehead against the rough, splintering wood to catch her breath. Her hands were raw, her clothes soaked through to the bone. At 28, she felt a decade older. The ranch was failing, the soil was stubborn, and the bank was breathing down her neck. But tonight, she just needed to keep the roof from blowing off. Through the howling wind, another sound registered, rhythmic, heavy, hoofbeats, not one horse but half a dozen. Cora's heart hammered a frantic tattoo against her ribs. No one rode out in a storm like this unless they were running from the devil, or doing his work. She scrambled around the side of the barn, slipping through the loose boards at the back just as a group of riders breached the front yard. She didn't run for the cabin. If they were drifters looking for trouble, the cabin was the first place they'd go. Instead, she scaled the rickety wooden ladder into the barn's hayloft, pulling her soaked skirts close, and threw herself flat against the floorboards. Below her, the barn doors were kicked open. The heavy thud of boots and the snorting of wet, exhausted horses filled the space. The smell of ozone and wet earth was suddenly overpowered by the sharp stench of cheap tobacco, wet wool, and gun oil. "Check the house?" a gruff voice asked. "Lights are out. Widow's probably hiding under her bed," another replied, striking a match. The flare of light slipped through the cracks in the floorboards, illuminating Cora's terrified eyes. She recognized the man holding the match. It was one of Harlan Croft's hired guns, a ruthless enforcer named Stokes. "Leave her be. We ain't getting paid to spook widows," a third voice growled. "We wait here till the storm peaks. Once the thunder is steady enough to drown out the rifles, we ride on the Vance estate." Cora stopped breathing. Silas Vance. "Boss wants him dead tonight," Stokes said, the clink of a whiskey flask passing between them. "Burn the main house, shoot anything that comes out the front door, and scatter the herd. Make it look like rustlers got greedy." "Vance has 20 men in that bunkhouse," the younger one muttered nervously. "Which is why we hit the main house first, cut the head off the snake. Vance dies tonight, and Croft owns this valley by morning." Up in the loft, Cora pressed her hand over her mouth. Silas Vance was a cold, impenetrable fortress of a man. Just last month, she had sat across from his massive mahogany desk, swallowing her pride to ask for an extension on her feed credit. He had stared at her with eyes like slate, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he told her business was business and charity wasn't in his ledger. He had let her walk out into the dust, knowing her cattle would starve. "Let him burn," a dark, bitter part of her whispered. "Let the arrogant cattle baron reap what he sowed." But then the memory of her late husband flashed in her mind. Elias's cruel laughter, the bruises she had hidden beneath high collars, the way the town had looked the other way because it was easier than standing up to a violent man. Cora knew exactly what happens when good people stay quiet in the dark. She couldn't let a man be slaughtered in his bed. Moving with agonizing slowness, Cora crawled toward the loft window. The wind howled, masking the creak of the floorboards. She slipped through the opening, dropping 8 feet into the deep mud of the pig pen. She bit back a cry as her knees absorbed the impact, then scrambled up and ran for the cabin. Inside, the house was pitch black and freezing. She found Lily curled beneath a quilt, clutching her rag doll. "Lily, baby, wake up," Cora whispered, shaking the 5-year-old gently. Lily blinked sleep-heavy eyes. "Mama, you're all wet." "We're playing a game, sweetie, the hiding game." Cora wrapped the child in a heavy wool blanket and carried her to the pantry. She lifted the heavy oak trapdoor that led to the root cellar. It was damp and smelled of old potatoes, but it was safe. "I need you to stay down here," Cora said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "Do not make a sound. Do not come up, no matter what you hear, until Mama opens this door. Do you understand?" Lily's lower lip quivered, but she nodded, her large eyes reflecting Cora's own terror. "Are the bad men here, Mama?" "Mama's going to make sure they go away." Cora kissed her daughter's forehead, a lingering, desperate press of her lips, and closed the trap door. She grabbed Elias's oversized yellow slicker from the peg by the door. She couldn't risk getting her mare from the barn where the men were. She would have to take the old draft horse they kept in the lean-to attached to the house. He was slow, but he was sturdy. Cora threw a bridle over the draft horse's head, didn't bother with a saddle, and hoisted herself onto his broad, bare back. She kicked the horse into motion. They burst from the lean-to, plunging directly into the teeth of the storm. The wind ripped at her slicker, the rain blinding her. She guided the horse toward the tree line, praying the darkness would swallow them. Lightning flashed, a brilliant, jagged fork that turned the world blinding white for a fraction of a second. "Hey!" a voice yelled from the barn. "Someone's riding out!" Cora kicked the horse harder. "Go! Go!" she screamed, flattening herself against his wet mane. A gunshot cracked, a sharp, terrifying sound that ripped through the thunder. Cora gasped as a sudden, searing heat tore through her left shoulder. The sheer force of it nearly knocked her off the horse. She grabbed the beast's mane with her good hand, her vision swimming with black spots. The coppery taste of blood filled her mouth as she bit her own cheek to keep from screaming. Guns. It always came back to guns and bleeding. "Get her!" someone shouted behind her. But the draft horse, spooked by the gunshot and the storm, found a gear Cora didn't know he had. He surged into the thick pines, the heavy branches whipping against Cora's face, hiding them from the pursuing riders. Blood soaked through her dress, hot and sticky beneath the slicker. The pain was blinding, radiating down to her fingertips. Every jolt of the horse's gait threatened to pull her into unconsciousness. She focused entirely on the image of Lily in the dark cellar. She couldn't die. If she died, Lily would be alone. She rode for what felt like hours, though it could have only been 20 minutes. The Vance estate loomed ahead, a fortress of iron gates and stone walls. The massive main house was dark, utterly unbothered by the storm, completely unaware of the wolves closing in. Cora didn't stop at the gate. She forced the exhausted horse over a low section of the perimeter fence, nearly falling as he stumbled on the landing. She rode straight up the manicured driveway to the massive oak front doors of the mansion. She slid off the horse, her legs giving out the moment her boots hit the gravel. Gasping, clutching her bleeding shoulder, she crawled up the 3 stone steps to the wide porch. She slammed her fist against the heavy wood. Once. Twice. "Vance!" she screamed, though her voice was barely a whisper against the roaring wind. "Silas!" She hit the door a 3rd time, leaving a smear of crimson on the white-painted wood. The darkness at the edge of her vision finally closed in. Cora slumped against the frame, the cold seeping into her bones. Just as the world faded to black, the heavy oak door swung inward, and the warm, golden light of a kerosene lamp spilled over her. Above her, casting a massive shadow into the storm, stood the ruthless Silas Vance, a revolver gripped tightly in his hand. Silas Vance was a man who slept with the ghosts of his past, which meant he rarely slept at all. For 5 years, the massive master bedroom of the Vance estate had felt more like a mausoleum than a sanctuary. The king-sized mahogany bed was a vast, empty expanse. The wind howled outside, throwing sheets of icy rain against the thick glass of the windows. But Silas was already awake. He lay perfectly still in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the violent symphony of the Texas thunderstorm. It was the kind of weather that drowned out sins, the kind of weather where desperate men did desperate things. Then, a sound broke through the thunder. It was faint, irregular. A heavy, wet thud against the heavy oak of the front doors downstairs. Silas was out of bed before the second knock landed. He didn't bother with a lantern. He knew every inch of this house in the pitch black. He reached out, his calloused fingers wrapping around the cold, familiar grip of the Colt 45 resting on his nightstand. He moved silently down the sweeping grand staircase, his bare feet making no sound on the imported rugs. He thumbed the hammer of the revolver back. The metallic click was sharp and deadly in the cavernous foyer. Through the frosted side panels of the door, a silhouette slumped against the glass. Silas positioned himself off-center, his gun raised, and threw the deadbolt back with his free hand. He pulled the door open, ready to fire. The wind shrieked, driving freezing rain into the foyer. A small, soaked figure fell forward, practically collapsing into Silas's boots. Silas lowered the gun, his slate-gray eyes widening in rare shock. It was a woman. Her golden-brown hair was plastered to her pale face, her lips a bruised shade of blue. She was drowning in an oversized, mud-caked yellow slicker. But what caught Silas's immediate attention was the dark, glistening crimson stain spreading across her left shoulder, washing away in the rain. He knew her. Cora Bennett. The stubborn, desperate widow who had sat in his study 4 weeks ago, her chin held high as she begged for a line of credit she had no collateral to back. He had turned her down flat. He didn't run a charity. Mrs. Bennett? Silas dropped to one knee, the cold mud soaking into his trousers. Cora's eyelids fluttered. She grabbed the lapel of his nightshirt with a blood-slicked hand, her grip shockingly strong for a woman half dead. "Croft!" she gasped, her voice ragged and torn. "Harlan Croft, his men, they're coming tonight." Silas's jaw tightened. "How many?" "A dozen," she choked out, a violent shiver racking her small frame. "To burn the house, kill you. They're right behind me." Her eyes rolled back and the fight finally left her. She went entirely limp. Silas caught her before her head could strike the hardwood floor. "Bess!" he roared, a booming, guttural command that tore through the quiet house. "Bess, get the hell up!" He didn't wait for his foreman. Silas scooped Cora into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. He carried her quickly into the sprawling parlor, kicking the door shut behind him, and laid her down on the expensive leather Chesterfield sofa. He didn't care about the mud or the blood ruining the upholstery. Heavy boots pounded down the back hallway. Bass, a towering, heavily scarred veteran who had been with Silas for a decade, burst into the foyer holding a Winchester repeater. He took one look at the bloody woman on the sofa and the grim, lethal expression on Silas's face. "Riders coming," Silas ordered, his voice suddenly terrifyingly calm, the voice of a general going to war. "Croft's men, a dozen of them. They think we're asleep. Kill the lights in the bunkhouse. Tell the boys to take the windows. Nobody fires until they cross the tree line." Bass didn't ask questions. He gave a sharp nod. "I'll box them in from the East Ridge." He vanished into the shadows of the house. Silas turned back to Cora. He grabbed a heavy woolen throw blanket from a nearby armchair and draped it over her shivering legs. "Stay down," he whispered, though she was barely conscious. He strode to the gun cabinet against the far wall, unlocked it, and pulled out a Winchester 1873 rifle and 2 boxes of ammunition. He shoved the cartridges into his pockets, cracked the parlor window open just an inch, and waited. The storm raged on. For 3 agonizing minutes, there was nothing but the sound of rain. Then, a flash of lightning illuminated the front lawn. Shadows were moving through the perimeter gate. 10, maybe 12 riders, dismounting, moving with the practiced stealth of paid killers. They were carrying rifles and heavy glass bottles stuffed with rags, kerosene. Silas didn't wait for them to light the fuses. He rested the barrel of his rifle on the windowsill, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The blast shattered the night. The lead rider dropped instantly, clutching his chest. Chaos erupted. The element of surprise, Croft's greatest weapon, evaporated in a hail of lead. The night lit up with the stroboscopic flashes of muzzle fire. From the bunkhouse across the yard, Bass and his men opened up a devastating crossfire. Cora jolted awake at the deafening roar of gunfire. She screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the battle. She threw her hands over her ears, curling into a tight, trembling ball on the sofa. Elias. The sound of the gunshots triggered a visceral panic inside her, transporting her back to the nights her late husband would get drunk and shoot at the floorboards to make her dance. She couldn't breathe. The smell of cordite and sulfur filled the parlor, suffocating her. From her position on the floor, through the strobe light flashes of gunfire outside, she saw Silas Vance. He stood by the window like a statue carved from granite. He was cold, methodical, and brutally efficient. Every time he worked the lever of his rifle, a brass casing clattered to the floor, and a man outside fell. There was no rage in his face, no panic. He was a man who understood violence intimately, wielding it like a surgeon's scalpel. It was terrifying. And yet, looking at his broad back shielding her from the flying glass, Cora realized she had never felt safer. The firefight lasted less than 5 minutes. Caught in a lethal trap, the surviving mercenaries panicked, abandoned their dead, and fled back into the tree line, their horses scattering in the storm. Silence fell, heavy and ringing. "Hold fire!" Bass's voice echoed from the yard. "They're running!" Silas didn't lower his weapon until the sound of hoofbeats faded entirely. He engaged the safety, leaned the rifle against the wall, and turned around. The parlor was a mess of shattered glass and bullet holes, but Cora was safe. She was huddled against the leather cushions, her breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps, her eyes squeezed shut, hands clamped over her ears. Silas felt a strange, unfamiliar pang in his chest. He struck a match and lit a single kerosene lamp on the side table, keeping the flame low. "It's over," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, a stark contrast to the man who had just killed 3 people without blinking. "They're gone." Cora opened her eyes. She looked at him, at the rifle nearby, and then down at her own shoulder. The adrenaline of the ride was wearing off, and the agony of the bullet wound was finally registering. She let out a sharp, breathless sob of pain. Silas moved quickly. "I need to look at that." He went to a mahogany cabinet and pulled out a clean white towel, a bottle of high-proof whiskey, and a small leather medical kit. He knelt beside the sofa. Up close, she looked incredibly fragile. Her lips were trembling and her skin was icy cold. "I have to take the slicker off," he said. He didn't wait for permission. He knew she didn't have the strength. His large hands, rough and smelling of burnt gunpowder, were remarkably gentle as he unbuckled the heavy yellow coat and eased it off her right arm. When he got to the left shoulder, the fabric of her cotton dress was fused to the wound by dried blood. "This is going to hurt," he warned her, his gray eyes locking onto her hazel ones. Cora gritted her teeth, did her purr. "Do it." Silas took a pair of heavy shears from his kit and cut the fabric away, exposing her shoulder. The bullet hadn't lodged. It was a clean graze, a deep, ugly furrow carving through the meat of her upper arm. It was bleeding sluggishly, but the damage wasn't fatal. As he cleared away the ruined fabric, the low lamplight caught something else. Silas froze. Beneath her collarbone, trailing down toward her ribs, were scars. Old, faded, jagged white lines that told a story of systematic, repeated cruelty. It wasn't the kind of scarring you got from farm work or an accident. Silas was a man of the frontier. He knew what a cigarette burn looked like. He knew what a belt buckle did to human skin. He didn't say a word, but his jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked in his cheek. He looked at Cora's face. She was staring at the wall, her cheeks flushed with a sudden, humiliating heat. She knew what he saw, and she was bracing herself for the pity or the uncomfortable questions. He gave her neither. "It's a through-and-through graze," Silas said, his tone perfectly level, granting her the dignity of ignoring the scars. "No lead inside, but it needs to be cleaned and stitched. I'm going to pour whiskey over it. Bite down on this." He offered her a clean, folded leather strap from his kit. Cora took it, placing it between her teeth. She nodded. Silas uncorked the bottle and poured the raw alcohol directly over the open wound. Cora arched off the sofa, a muffled scream tearing from her throat. Her good hand flew out and gripped Silas's forearm with bone-crushing force. He held perfectly still, letting her ground herself against his solid strength, his hand resting reassuringly on her uninjured shoulder. "Breathe, Cora," he murmured, using her first name without thinking. "Just breathe. The worst is over." He took a curved needle and a length of silk thread. Working with quick, steady precision, he put 5 stitches into her shoulder, pulling the torn flesh back together. Cora squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking from the corners, but she didn't make another sound. When he was finished, he bound the shoulder tightly with clean white gauze. He pulled the blanket up to her chin, tucking it in to trap the heat of her body. He sat back on his heels, uncorked the whiskey again, and took a long pull straight from the bottle. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked at the woman lying on his ruined sofa. "You rode 5 miles in a torrential flood with a bullet in your arm to warn a man who threw you out of his office last month," Silas stated, his voice quiet in the aftermath of the violence. "Why?" Cora spat the leather strap out of her mouth. She was exhausted, pale as a ghost, but when she looked at him, her eyes were filled with an unyielding steel. "Because I have a daughter," Cora whispered, her voice trembling. "And I know what it looks like when bad men do whatever they want while good people look the other way. I couldn't sit in the dark and let them murder you." Silas stared at her. For 5 years, he had believed that loyalty and courage were things you bought with coin or commanded with a gun. Looking at the battered, bleeding woman on his couch, he realized how profoundly wrong he had been. "Your daughter," Silas said, a sudden urgency in his chest. "Where is she?" "In the root cellar," Cora breathed, her eyes dropping shut. "She's safe. I hid her. I'll have Bass ride out and get her right now." "No." Cora's eyes snapped open, panicking. "No. I told her not to open that door for anyone but me. She's terrified of men. She won't come out. I have to go to her." She tried to sit up, but her arms screamed in agony and Silas gently pushed her back down. "You're not riding anywhere tonight," Silas said firmly. "You've lost blood. You'll pass out before you hit the main road." "I have to, "At first light," Silas promised, his voice taking on a low, soothing cadence that he hadn't used since his own son was alive. "I swear to you on my life, Mrs. Bennet. At first light, I will personally drive you there and we will get your little girl. But tonight, you need to survive." Cora looked into his slate-gray eyes. For the first time, they weren't cold. They were anchors in the storm. The exhaustion finally overran her defenses. She let her head fall back against the leather cushion, the darkness rushing up to claim her. Silas stayed kneeling beside her long after she fell asleep, listening to the rain, a dangerous protective fury taking root in his hollow chest. Harlan Croft had made a fatal mistake tonight. He had aimed for Silas Vance, but he had hit Cora Bennett, and Silas was going to make him pay for every drop of blood she spilled. Dawn broke over the Texas Valley like a bruised eye, swollen, gray, and sullen. The thunderstorm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of deep mud, snapped branches, and a bone-chilling dampness. Cora woke to the smell of strong black coffee and the throbbing, rhythmic ache in her left shoulder. She opened her eyes, blinking against the muted morning light filtering through the bullet-shattered windows of the parlor. Someone, Silas, had draped a thick, heavy quilt over her during the night, replacing the ruined blanket. The fire in the hearth was roaring, casting a warm orange glow across the room. Silas Vance was sitting in a high-backed leather chair near the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, a Winchester resting across his thighs. He looked like a gargoyle keeping a silent, eternal vigil. He hadn't slept. He hadn't even changed out of his mud-caked boots. The moment Cora shifted, his eyes snapped to her. "Don't move too fast. The stitches will pull." The events of the previous night crashed down on Cora like a collapsing roof, the storm, the gunshot. The blood on the porch. Lily. Cora shot upright, crying out as a white-hot spike of pain lanced through her shoulder. But she ignored it, throwing the quilt off. "My daughter, I need to get back. What time is it?" "Just past 6, Silas said, standing up and setting his coffee aside. "Bass is hitching the enclosed buggy right now. I'm taking you." Cora wanted to argue, wanted to demand her horse, but she looked down at herself. She was wearing her ruined, blood-stained dress, her arm bound tightly to her chest. She was in no condition to ride, and she knew it. She swallowed her pride. "Thank you." 15 minutes later, they were on the road. Silas drove the buggy, the two powerful draft horses navigating the deep mud with ease. 4 of Silas's heavily armed ranch hands rode alongside them as an escort. The ride was silent, the tension in the enclosed cabin suffocating. Cora stared out the small window, her uninjured hand twisting the fabric of her skirt into knots. "Please be safe. Please, God, let her be safe." When the buggy finally crested the hill overlooking her property, Cora's heart stopped. The mercenaries had left their mark. The small, weathered barn where she had hidden was a complete ruin, its doors ripped off their hinges. Her corral fences were smashed, her 3 scrawny cows nowhere to be seen. The front door of her modest wooden cabin hung open, swaying on a broken hinge. "They tore it apart," Silas noted grimly, his hand instinctively resting on his revolver. Before the buggy even came to a complete stop, Cora shoved the door open and half fell into the mud. She stumbled forward, ignoring Silas's shout for her to wait. She ran past the ruined cabin, her boots sinking deep into the muck, heading straight for the back of the property. The heavy oak trapdoor to the root cellar was exactly where she had left it, concealed beneath a pile of wet canvas and firewood. It hadn't been touched. "Lily!" Cora screamed, falling to her knees in the mud and hauling the heavy door open with her good arm. The stench of wet earth and rotting potatoes hit her, but what terrified her was the silence. "Lily, baby, it's Mama!" Cora scrambled down the short wooden ladder into the pitch-black cellar. In the furthest corner, huddled beneath the damp wool blanket, was a small shape. Cora crawled over the dirt floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled the blanket back. Lily was curled into a tight ball, her eyes squeezed shut, but she wasn't sleeping. She was shaking, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that rattled her small teeth. Her lips were blue, her skin shockingly pale, but when Cora touched the little girl's forehead, it was radiating a terrifying, unnatural heat. "No, no, no," Cora sobbed, pulling the child into her lap. Lily felt like a furnace trapped in ice. "Lily, look at me. Open your eyes, sweetie." Lily's eyelids fluttered, heavy and unfocused. "Mama?" she whispered, her voice a reedy, wet wheeze. A harsh, rattling cough seized the little girl's chest, sounding like glass scraping against bone. The damp, freezing cold of the cellar, combined with the terror of the night, had settled deep into her lungs. Cora knew that sound. It was the sound of pneumonia. On the frontier, that sound was a death sentence for a child. "I've got you, baby. Mama's here." Cora tried to lift her, but with her left arm immobilized, she couldn't manage the child's dead weight. She let out a frustrated, desperate cry. A shadow blocked the light from the trapdoor above. Silas descended the ladder, his large frame making the small cellar feel even more claustrophobic. He took one look at the shivering, flushed child, and the absolute paralyzing terror on Cora's face. He didn't say a word. He simply knelt in the dirt, slid his large, warm arms under the child, and lifted Lily as easily as if she were a feather. He turned and carried her up into the gray morning light. Cora scrambled up the ladder after him. "We need to get her inside, build a fire," Cora stammered, running toward the ruined cabin. "I have extra blankets in the chest." "Cora, stop!" Silas's voice was firm, halting her in her tracks. He stood in the mud, cradling the desperately sick child against his broad chest. He nodded toward the cabin. "Look at it. The roof leaks. The windows are smashed. Your firewood is soaked through. It'll take 3 hours just to get the hearth warm enough to matter. Cora stared at her ruined home, the reality of her poverty and helplessness crashing over her. "But I have to—" Her voice broke. She had spent 2 years fighting to keep this roof over her daughter's head, fighting to prove she didn't need a man to survive, and now the cold was going to take her daughter away. Silas stepped closer. He didn't look at her with pity, and he didn't issue a command. He lowered his head so he was looking directly into her frantic, tear-filled eyes. "My house is built of stone," Silas said softly. "It has 10 fireplaces that are already burning. Dr. Evans owes me his practice. I can have a rider fetch him from town, and he will be at my estate in an hour, with medicine." Cora swallowed hard, looking at her daughter who was coughing weakly against Silas's shirt. "I can't afford a doctor. I can't afford—" She looked up at Silas, her pride warring with her maternal terror. "I don't have anything to give you." "I am not asking for anything." Silas's slate-gray eyes were incredibly intense. "I am offering my hand, Cora. Take it. Let me help her." It was the hardest thing she had ever done, laying down the armor she had worn for years. But looking at the man who had just shot 3 killers to protect his home, and seeing the profound gentleness with which he held her dying child, Cora made her choice. She nodded once. "Please." Silas didn't waste a second. He carried Lily straight to the enclosed buggy, shouting orders to Bass as he climbed in. "Ride to town! Drag Doc Evans out of bed by his collar if you have to. Tell him to bring his pneumonia kit to the estate, now!" The ride back to the Vance estate was a blur of terror. Cora sat in the carriage, clutching Lily's hot little hand, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. Silas sat opposite them, silent, his presence a heavy, grounding weight in the small space. When they arrived, the estate was a hive of activity. Silas carried Lily upstairs to a massive guest bedroom on the 2nd floor. A maid was already turning down the thick, feather-down bed and piling on heavy wool quilts. The fireplace was blazing, radiating a luxurious, life-saving heat. Silas laid the child down gently. "The doctor will be here any minute," he promised Cora. He stepped back, giving her space, watching as she sat on the edge of the bed, pressing cool, damp cloths to Lily's flushed forehead. True to Silas's word, Dr. Evans arrived in a sweat-lathered rush less than an hour later. He shooed Silas out of the room but allowed Cora to stay. For the next 2 hours, the doctor worked, administering quinine, applying hot mustard poultices to the child's chest, and forcing a bitter syrup down her throat to ease the congestion. Silas waited in the vast, echoing hallway outside the bedroom. He leaned against the expensive wallpaper, arms crossed, staring at the floor. He remembered waiting outside a very similar door 5 years ago, listening to his wife's breathing grow shallower, listening to the doctor tell him there was nothing more his money could buy. The phantom grip of that old panic seized his throat. He couldn't go through it again. He couldn't watch another innocent life slip away under his roof. Finally, the bedroom door opened. "Doctor!" Evans stepped out, rolling down his shirt sleeves, smelling of camphor and exhaustion. Silas straightened up immediately. "Well?" "She's a fighter," Evans said, wiping his brow. "The fever is broken. The congestion in her lungs is severe, but the poultices are doing their job. If she had stayed in that cold, damp cellar another few hours, she would have drowned in her own fluids. But she's going to live, Silas. She just needs rest, warmth, and time." Silas closed his eyes, exhaling a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 5 years. "Thank you, Doc. Put whatever you need on my account." Evans nodded and made his way down the stairs. Silas turned and looked through the open doorway. Cora was sitting in a velvet chair pulled close to the bed, holding Lily's sleeping hand. The terrifying rattle in the child's chest had smoothed out into a deep, even breathing. Silas walked quietly into the room. Cora looked up. The adrenaline had completely left her system, leaving behind dark, bruised circles under her eyes and a pale fragility. Yet, as she stood up and walked toward him, Silas saw that her spine was perfectly straight. She stepped out into the hallway, pulling the heavy oak door nearly shut behind her so as not to wake the child. She stood before him in the opulent gas-lit corridor of his mansion, a woman with nothing to her name, wearing a blood-stained dress, looking at a millionaire. "She's sleeping," Cora whispered, her voice rough with emotion. She looked down at her hands, then took a deep breath and looked Silas squarely in the eye. "I owe you her life," Cora said slowly, carefully measuring her words. "And I owe you for the doctor, the medicine, and the damage to your sofa. I will work it off. I'll bake, I'll clean, I'll scrub your floors if I have to. Every penny will be accounted for." Silas frowned, his brow furrowing. "I told you I don't want your money. And I told you I don't take charity." Cora took a step closer, drawing a firm, invisible line between them. Her hazel eyes were fierce, guarding a deeply wounded pride. "I know how men in this world operate, Mr. Vance. I know what they expect when they give a woman a roof and a bed. I am here because my daughter would die otherwise. But I am not your charity case, and I am not a woman you can buy or keep." The memory of her scarred shoulder flashed in Silas's mind. He realized she wasn't just talking about money. She was talking about survival. She was establishing her autonomy in a house where she had absolutely no power. It was an act of profound, staggering bravery. Silas didn't crowd her. He didn't raise his voice. He stood his ground, letting his slate-gray eyes soften, dropping the mask of the ruthless cattle baron entirely. "I don't deal in charity, Mrs. Bennet," Silas said, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated in the quiet hall. "And I have never in my entire life bought a woman. You are in this house because last night you rode through a storm and took a bullet meant for me. You saved my life. I saved your daughter's." He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he gently tucked a stray, mud-caked lock of hair behind her ear. Cora flinched slightly at the sudden movement, but she didn't pull away. "We are even," Silas whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again. "You are my guest. You answer to no one, especially not me. The doors are unlocked. When you want to leave, you leave. But until that little girl is running on her own 2 feet, you stay. Agreed?" Cora searched his face, looking for the trap, the hidden condition, the cruelty she had come to expect from men. She found none, only a quiet, unwavering respect. The tension drained from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt the exhausting, heavy armor she wore begin to crack. "Agreed," she breathed. Silas nodded once, took a step back to give her space, and turned down the hall. Cora watched his broad back as he walked away, a strange, terrifying warmth blooming in her chest. She had come to the Vance estate to survive a storm, but looking at the man who had just surrendered his power to make her feel safe, she realized the real danger hadn't been the men with guns. The real danger was that Silas Vance was a man she could easily, foolishly, fall in love with. A week passed, and the brutal Texas winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the valley. Inside the stone walls of the Vance estate, time seemed to operate on a different cadence. For Cora Bennett, a woman whose entire adult life had been measured by the grueling rhythm of sun-up chores and sundown exhaustion, the sudden absence of backbreaking labor was unnerving. Her shoulder was healing cleanly under Dr. Evans's care, the jagged furrow knitting into a tight pink scar. Lily's recovery, however, was the true miracle. The horrific rattle in the 5-year-old's chest had subsided into a wet cough, and the terrifying fever had burned itself out, leaving behind a pale but smiling child who now spent her afternoons bundled in thick quilts by the parlor fire, playing with her rag doll. Cora, however, refused to be a ghost haunting Silas Vance's luxurious halls. True to her word, she sought to pay her debt in the only currency she had, her labor. She took over the estate's massive kitchen, politely but firmly shooing Silas's cook, Mrs. Higgins, into a supervisory role. Cora baked bread that filled the cavernous stone house with the scent of yeast and honey. She scrubbed the cast-iron stoves until they gleamed. She needed the work. Keeping her hands busy kept her mind from dwelling on the smoldering ruins of her own ranch and the looming shadow of Harlan Croft. Silas noticed. It was impossible not to. For 5 years, his house had been a silent, echoing tomb, a monument to the wife and son he had buried. Now there was laughter, faint and hesitant but there, drifting from the parlor. There was the smell of cinnamon and roasting meat instead of stale cigar smoke and floor wax. And there was Cora. He watched her from the periphery, studying the rigid set of her spine and the guarded vigilance in her hazel eyes. She was like a wild mustang that had been beaten too many times. She would accept the feed, but she would never let you put a saddle on her. Silas respected that fiercely. He kept his distance, offering quiet nods in the hallway and ensuring she had whatever supplies she needed, never pushing the boundaries she had drawn. But the ice around his own heart, frozen solid for half a decade, was beginning to crack. Late one Tuesday afternoon, the winter sun broke through the heavy cloud cover, casting long golden rays across the estate's wraparound porch. Cora was in the kitchen wiping flour from her apron when she glanced out the large bay window. Silas was sitting on the top step of the porch. He was out of his usual tailored waistcoats and heavy wool suits, wearing only a faded Henley shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, exposing thick forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. A hunting knife gleamed in his right hand. In his left, he held a block of pale ash wood. He was whittling. Cora wiped her hands on a towel and stepped closer to the glass, her breath catching slightly in her throat. The man who had ruthlessly gunned down 3 mercenaries a week ago was currently carving delicate, meticulous curls of wood from the block. His slate-gray eyes were narrowed in deep concentration, the harsh lines of his face remarkably relaxed. Then a small figure bundled in a knitted shawl pushed through the heavy front doors. Cora's heart leaped into her throat. Lily! The little girl stepped onto the porch, her boots making a soft scuffing sound against the floorboards. She stopped a few feet away from Silas. Lily was terrified of men. Elias's booming voice and heavy hands had taught her early on that the large creatures who smelled of tobacco and sweat brought only pain. Cora reached for the kitchen door handle, ready to rush out and intervene. But she stopped. Silas didn't turn around. He didn't make any sudden movements. He simply continued to whittle, his knife making a soothing, rhythmic shh sound against the wood. "Afternoon, Miss Lily," Silas rumbled, his voice low and incredibly gentle, stripped of all its usual command. He didn't look up, intuitively knowing that direct eye contact would spook her. "Sun feels good today, doesn't it?" Lily hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She looked at the wood shavings curling around Silas's boots like pale ribbons. "What are you making, Mr. Vance?" she piped up, her voice as thin as a bird's chirp. Silas paused. He blew the sawdust from the block and slowly held it out toward her, still keeping his gaze averted. "Well, I was aiming for a mighty fine galloping pony, but right now it looks a bit like a lumpy potato with legs. What do you think?" Lily took a tentative step closer, peering at the carved ash. A tiny, shy smile broke across her face. "It has a nice head," she offered generously. "You think so?" Silas finally looked at her, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "I was hoping to give it to a brave young lady I know once it's finished. A brave young lady who fought off a nasty fever. Know anyone like that?" Lily's eyes widened, shining with sudden delight. "Me? If you'd like it." Silas pulled his hand back, resting the half-finished horse on his knee. "I still have to carve the mane. You can come sit over there on the bench and supervise if you want. Make sure I don't mess up the tail." Lily looked back at the door, then at the wide, sturdy bench situated a safe distance away from Silas. Slowly she walked over and climbed onto the seat, tucking her legs under her shawl. She sat in silence, watching the big, dangerous man carefully carve a toy just for her. Behind the glass, Cora pressed her hand against her mouth, a hot, unexpected tear slipping down her cheek. Elias had never made a toy for his daughter. He had only ever broken them. But Silas Vance, the ruthless cattle baron the whole valley feared, was sitting in the cold sun, shrinking his massive presence down just to make a traumatized 5-year-old feel safe. Cora realized in that moment that the armor she wore wasn't just cracking. It was falling apart completely. Silas wasn't the monster she had assumed him to be. He was a protector, a man who understood that true strength didn't require cruelty. Later that evening, after Lily had been tucked into bed with her new, perfectly sanded wooden pony, Cora found Silas in his vast, leather-scented study. The room was illuminated by a single brass reading lamp on his desk. He was hunched over a large parchment map spread across the mahogany surface, an empty tumbler of whiskey resting near his elbow. Bass, his massive, scarred foreman, stood on the other side of the desk, tracing a line on the paper with a thick finger. Cora knocked lightly on the open door frame. Both men looked up. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her voice quiet. "No." Silas straightened up immediately, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness. "Come in, Cora. Bass and I were just trying to put a puzzle together, and we're missing a piece." "A bloody big piece," Bass grunted, offering Cora a respectful nod before stepping back. Cora walked into the room, stopping at the edge of the desk. She looked down at the map. It was a topographical layout of the entire valley. Various parcels of land were shaded in red ink. "What is this?" she asked. "This is everything Harlan Croft has purchased, seized, or foreclosed on in the last 2 years," Silas explained, tapping the red-shaded areas. "He's been methodical, using shell companies, buying up debts, forcing ranchers out." Cora studied the map. The red areas formed a strange, almost circular pattern on the western edge of the valley. And right in the dead center of that circle was a small, unshaded square. Her breath hitched. "That's my ranch." "Exactly," Silas said, his slate-gray eyes meeting hers. "I thought Croft attacked my estate last week because I refused to sell him grazing rights. I thought it was a power play. But I was wrong." He pointed to the cluster of red parcels around her unshaded square. "Croft doesn't care about my cattle. He cares about this. Your land is the center of the wheel, Cora. Everything he's done in the last 2 years has been a slow, quiet maneuver to surround your property. You are the final piece he needs." "But why?" Cora shook her head, thoroughly bewildered. "My land is barren. The soil is mostly clay and rock. I can barely keep 50 head of cattle alive on it. Elias bought it for pennies because no one else wanted it. There's no gold, no silver, no timber. Why would a man like Croft hire mercenaries and commit murder for a patch of dead dirt?" "That's the missing puzzle piece," Bass chimed in, his deep voice rumbling in his chest. "Men like Croft don't spend thousands of dollars to steal dirt unless that dirt is hiding a fortune." Silas leaned over the desk, his presence commanding and intense. "We checked the county records in town, the deed and the standard property lines. There's nothing unusual, but standard deeds don't show what's underneath the topsoil." "A geological survey," Cora murmured, realization dawning on her. "Right," Silas confirmed. 10 years ago, the federal government sent a team of surveyors through this territory to map the terrain for the railroad. The railroad never came, but the maps were drawn, detailed deep earth topography. "Where are those maps?" Cora asked, her pulse beginning to quicken. "The county surveyor's office was shut down 5 years ago when the town ran out of funding," Silas said. "All the old territorial records were boxed up and shoved into the basement of the abandoned Presbyterian church on the edge of town, right near the canyon." "Then we go get them," Cora said without a second of hesitation. Silas looked at her, his expression tightening. "I will go get them. Bass and I will ride out tomorrow night. You're staying here, where it's safe." "No." Cora planted her hands on the edge of his mahogany desk, leaning in. The fierce, independent fire that had kept her alive through years of hell flared in her hazel eyes. "It is my land, Silas. It is my life Croft is trying to ruin. I am not going to sit in a gilded cage and wait for men to decide my fate. Not anymore. I'm going with you." Bass let out a low whistle, clearly impressed, and looked at his boss. Silas stared at Cora. He saw the stubborn jut of her chin, the unyielding steel in her gaze. He wanted to lock her in the house, to throw away the key and keep her insulated from the violence of the world. But he knew, with sudden, absolute clarity, that if he did that, he would break the very spirit he had come to admire so deeply. She wasn't a fragile thing to be hoarded. She was a survivor. A slow, reluctant smile touched the corner of Silas's mouth. "All right, Mrs. Bennet," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, sending a shiver down Cora's spine. "We ride at midnight." The abandoned Presbyterian church stood on a lonely bluff overlooking the jagged edge of the canyon, its white paint peeling like dead skin, its steeple pointing toward a starless, ink-black sky. Silas and Cora left their horses tied to a copse of twisted mesquite trees a quarter-mile away, approaching the church on foot. The midnight air was biting, carrying the sharp scent of pine and impending frost. Cora wore a pair of Silas's old denim trousers, tailored hastily with a belt, a dark wool coat, and her boots. She moved silently beside him, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Stay behind me," Silas breathed, his breath pluming in the cold air. He held a lantern in his left hand, the glass shuttered to hide the flame, and his Colt revolver in his right. They reached the heavy arched wooden doors of the church. A rusted padlock hung from the iron latch. Silas didn't bother picking it. He pulled a heavy iron crowbar from his coat, wedged it between the hasp and the rotting wood, and threw his weight into it. With a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night, the wood splintered and the lock gave way. He pushed the door open. The smell of dust, mildew, and decaying paper wafted out to greet them. They stepped into the narthex, and Silas unshuttered the lantern just enough to cast a thin, golden beam of light into the gloom. Rows of rotting pews stretched into the darkness. At the far end, near the ruined altar, was a heavy oak door leading to the basement archives. They moved swiftly down the center aisle. Every creak of the floorboards felt unnervingly loud. "Down here," Silas whispered, pulling the basement door open. The stairs groaned in protest as they descended into the cavernous cellar. The room was a graveyard of bureaucracy. Dozens of wooden crates and iron-banded trunks were stacked haphazardly against the stone foundation, draped in thick cobwebs. "Look for leather-bound ledgers," Silas instructed, setting the lantern on a dusty table. "Dates spanning 1865 to 1868. Federal Geological Survey." They tore into the crates. For 20 agonizing minutes, there was only the sound of ripping wood, shifting paper, and their own rapid breathing. Dust choked the air, coating Cora's throat, but she ignored it, frantically digging through decades-old tax records and town council minutes. "Silas!" Cora gasped, pulling a massive, heavy ledger bound in cracked cowhide from the bottom of a trunk. She wiped the thick layer of dust from the cover. Stamped in faded gold leaf were the words, U.S. Department of the Interior, Geological and Hydrological Survey, Texas Territory. Silas crossed the room in 3 strides. He cleared the table with a sweep of his arm, sending old papers fluttering to the dirt floor, and gently laid the massive book down. He flipped past pages of dense, handwritten tables until he found the oversized, folded parchment maps tucked into the back cover. He unfolded the largest map, flattening the brittle creases. It was a subterranean rendering of the valley. "Look," Silas said, tracing a finger along a massive, dark blue shaded area that spider-webbed beneath the topography. "This isn't surface water. It's an aquifer, a massive underground lake." Cora leaned in, her shoulder brushing against his solid bicep. She followed the blue lines. They pooled and concentrated into a single massive choke point, a natural subterranean cavern where the water pressure built up before filtering out to feed the streams and wells of the entire valley. Silas laid a transparent overlay of the property lines over the geological map. The choke point, the only place where the aquifer rose close enough to the surface to be accessed without heavy mining equipment, sat dead center beneath Cora's ranch. "My God," Cora breathed, the sheer magnitude of the revelation hitting her like a physical blow. It's water. In a land where water is worth more than gold. "If Croft buys your land, he controls the aquifer," Silas said, his voice grim, his mind racing through the strategic implications. With a crew of engineers and some dynamite, he could collapse the natural outflow. He could dam the water underground. Cora stared at him in horror. "If he dams the aquifer..." "The entire valley dries up," Silas finished, his jaw clenched tight. "The creeks turn to dust. The wells go dry. Every rancher, every farmer, including me, we all go bankrupt within a season. Our cattle die of thirst. The banks foreclose on everyone. And Croft buys the entire valley for pennies on the dollar from the banks," Cora whispered, feeling sick to her stomach. "And then he reopens the aquifer. He'll own an empire, and he'll have a monopoly on the water to run it. It was a brilliant, sociopathic, and utterly devastating plan, and the only thing standing between Harlan Croft and his empire was Cora Bennett." "We have the proof," Silas said, carefully folding the map and shoving it into the inside pocket of his coat. "We take this to the federal marshal in Austin. We bypass the local authorities entirely. We can end him." "Well, now, I can't let you do that, Vance." The voice echoed down the basement stairs, dripping with lazy, arrogant malice. Silas extinguished the lantern instantly, plunging the basement into absolute blinding darkness. He grabbed Cora's arm, yanking her behind a stack of heavy wooden crates just as the blinding beam of a bullseye lantern swept down the staircase. Heavy boots descended the stairs. Not one man. 5. Cora peered through a crack between the crates. The man holding the lantern stepped into the basement. He wore a silver star pinned to his heavy canvas coat. Sheriff Miller, the man sworn to protect the town. "I know you're down here, Silas," Sheriff Miller called out, cocking a double-barreled shotgun. The metallic clack-clack was deafening. "Saw your horses tied up by the mesquite. Croft figured you'd come sniffing around the old record sooner or later. He pays me a very handsome premium to keep an eye on this place." Cora's blood ran cold. The law wasn't just blind. It was bought and paid for. "Come on out, Vance," Miller shouted. "Throw your guns out first. Croft wants the widow alive to sign some papers. But he don't care if she's breathing when she does it. And he'd pay double to see you dead." Silas leaned close to Cora, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "We can't shoot our way up that stairwell," he breathed, his voice barely a vibration against her skin. "It's a fatal choke point. We have to go up." Cora nodded, her mouth dry. Behind the crates, there was a narrow, rotting wooden ladder that led to a maintenance hatch in the ceiling, connecting to the area behind the church altar. "Quietly," Silas mouthed. While Miller and his men advanced slowly through the labyrinth of crates, sweeping their lanterns back and forth, Silas and Cora slipped up the ladder. Silas pushed the hatch open with excruciating slowness, wincing at every microscopic squeak of the rusty hinges. They hauled themselves up onto the main floor behind the altar. Below them, they heard Miller curse. "They're not in this corner. Spread out!" "Out the front door?" Cora whispered. "No," Silas replied, glancing at the arched windows. Moonlight revealed 2 more armed men standing guard by the front steps. They were completely surrounded. Silas looked up. Above the narthex, a spiral wooden staircase led up into the high bell tower. It was a dead end, but it was the only place left to hide. "Up," he commanded silently. They sprinted on the balls of their feet down the side aisle, slipping into the stairwell just as Miller's men emerged from the basement. "They went up," one of the deputies shouted, spotting a muddy footprint on the floorboards. Silas and Cora scrambled up the spiraling, rickety stairs. The air grew colder and thinner as they climbed into the steeple. They reached the belfry, a tiny 4-by-4-foot wooden platform directly beneath the massive bronze bell. The wind howled through the open wooden louvers, freezing and relentless. There was nowhere else to go. Below them, the heavy boots began to pound up the spiral stairs. Silas pulled Cora into the darkest corner of the belfry, furthest from the louvers where the moonlight spilled in. The space was impossibly tight. To stay in the shadows, Silas had to press Cora flush against the rough wooden wall and press his own body entirely against hers, caging her between the wall and his chest. "Don't move," Silas breathed, his slate-gray eyes locking onto hers in the dark. "Don't make a sound." The footsteps grew louder. Thump, thump, thump. Miller and his men reached the landing just below the belfry. The glow of their lantern bled up through the cracks in the floorboards, painting Silas's jawline in harsh, flickering light. Cora's heart was beating so violently she was certain the men below could hear it. Her breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. The trauma of her past, of being hunted and trapped by violent men, threatened to overwhelm her. She squeezed her eyes shut, a soft, involuntary whimper building in her throat. Silas felt her panic rising. Moving with agonizing slowness, he shifted his grip on his revolver, letting it hang at his side. He brought his large, calloused right hand up and gently, firmly, covered her mouth and nose, muffling her breathing. Cora's eyes snapped open. Silas didn't look away. His gaze was intense, fierce, and anchoring. "I've got you," his eyes said. "I will not let them touch you." The physical proximity was overwhelming. Cora was pressed flat against the wall, and Silas was a wall of solid, unyielding muscle against her front. She could feel the heavy, steady thud of his heart against her breasts. She could smell the cold night air, the ozone of the storm, and the deeply masculine scent of leather, cedar, and clean sweat clinging to his skin. The heat radiating from his body was the only thing keeping her from freezing in the icy wind whipping through the tower. "You see anything?" Miller's voice echoed up through the floorboards, so close he sounded like he was in the room with them. "Nothing," a deputy replied. "Door up to the belfry is locked tight from the outside, rusted shut. They couldn't have gotten in there. Check the choir loft, break the windows if you have to. They didn't just vanish." As the men argued below, Silas's thumb gently stroked the line of Cora's jaw. It was a subconscious gesture, an instinct to soothe her. The rough pad of his thumb against her soft skin sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. Cora stared up at him in the darkness. Her panic was entirely gone, replaced by an entirely different, much more dangerous kind of breathlessness. The danger outside the tower faded into a dull roar, entirely eclipsed by the overwhelming, consuming presence of the man holding her. She felt the heavy rise and fall of his chest. She felt the flex of his thigh against hers as he braced his weight to keep her hidden. For 5 years, Silas had been dead inside. For 4 years, Cora had flinched at the touch of a man. But trapped in a freezing bell tower, surrounded by men who wanted to kill them, neither of them felt fear anymore. They only felt each other. The air between them crackled with an undeniable white-hot tension, a desperate, profound realization of how fiercely they wanted to survive, just so they could figure out what this terrifying, beautiful gravity between them was. The heavy footsteps finally retreated down the spiral stairs, fading back into the main church, and eventually out the front doors. Silas didn't move. He kept his hand over Cora's mouth, his body pressed against hers, waiting a full 5 minutes to ensure it wasn't a trick. Finally, the distant sound of horses galloping away confirmed Miller and his men were gone. Silas slowly lowered his hand from her mouth. Cora took a deep, shuddering breath of the freezing air. She didn't push him away. She stayed exactly where she was, caged between his arms, looking up into his eyes. The moonlight caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone, the dark shadow of his stubble. "They're gone," Silas whispered, his voice impossibly rough, dropping to a low, gravelly register that made Cora's knees weak. He didn't step back either. His gaze dropped to her lips, and this time, he didn't look away. "I know," Cora breathed, her voice trembling, not from the cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming desire to close the agonizing fraction of an inch between them. They had the map. They knew Croft's secret. The war for the valley had just begun. But standing in the dark, breathing in each other's air, Silas and Cora realized that the battle for their own hearts had already been lost. The Texas spring did not arrive with a gentle thaw. It announced itself with a violent, earth-shaking tempest. 3 nights after their narrow escape from the bell tower, a massive squall line rolled over the valley. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, and thunder rattled the thick window panes of the Vance estate. Cora stood in the dark hallway of the 2nd floor, her hands gripping the mahogany banisters so tightly her knuckles were white. Every crack of lightning illuminated the corridor in blinding, stroboscopic flashes. Every boom of thunder sounded exactly like a shotgun discharging in a closed room. Bang! Cora flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. She wasn't in the luxurious manor anymore. Her mind had violently yanked her backward in time. She was back in the drafty, rotting cabin in Missouri. Elias was drunk, stumbling over the floorboards, firing his revolver into the walls just to watch her jump. "Dance, Cora," his slurred voice echoed in her memory. "Dance for me." She sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to force air into her burning lungs. She was safe. She knew she was safe. But the trauma etched into her nervous system didn't care about logic. It only knew the cadence of violence. A soft, melodic sound broke through the roaring in her ears. Cora opened her eyes, forcing herself to focus. The sound was coming from the guest bedroom at the end of the hall, Lily's room. Trembling, Cora pushed herself up from the floor and crept down the corridor. She pushed the heavy oak door open just a fraction. Inside, the hearth fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a warm, flickering light across the walls. Silas Vance was sitting on the edge of Lily's bed. The little girl had clearly woken up terrified of the storm. Instead of calling for a maid, Silas had come himself. The massive, hardened cattle baron had his thick arms wrapped securely around the 5-year-old, rocking her slowly. And he was singing. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone, stripped of all its usual abrasive command. He was singing an old, mournful cowboy ballad, the kind men sang to settle restless herds in the dead of night. "Oh, Shenandoah, I long to hear you. Away, you rolling river." Lily's small hands were fisted in the fabric of his dark shirt, her face buried in his chest. As the song rumbled through Silas's ribcage, the frantic tension in the child's body visibly melted away. She was entirely safe in his enormous shadow. Cora stood in the doorway, a profound, aching ache blooming in the center of her chest. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. She watched Silas smooth Lily's hair, tucking the heavy quilt around her shoulders as she finally drifted back to sleep. He sat there for a long time, watching the child breathe, an expression of such devastating sorrow on his face that it made Cora's heart physically hurt. When Silas finally stood and turned toward the door, Cora didn't hide. He stopped in the threshold, seeing her pale, tear-stained face in the dim hallway. He reached back and pulled Lily's door shut with a quiet click. "The thunder woke her," Silas murmured, his voice still rough. "She's all right now." "I know," Cora whispered. "Otis, I heard you." Silas looked down at her. He saw the violent tremor in her hands, the rapid, shallow rise and fall of her chest. He recognized the look of a cornered animal. He had seen it in the mirror often enough. "Come downstairs," he said gently. He didn't wait for an answer, turning and walking toward the grand staircase. Cora followed him into his private study. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and wood smoke. Silas walked to a mahogany credenza, bypassed the whiskey decanter, and poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher. He handed her one. "Drink," he ordered softly. "It grounds the nerves." Cora took a sip. Her hands were shaking so badly the glass rattled against her teeth. She set it down on the desk and wrapped her arms around her own torso. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't be falling apart like this." The thunder. It sounds like gunfire, Silas finished for her. Cora nodded, her gaze dropping to the Persian rug. Elias, my husband, he used to drink when the storms rolled in. He said the thunder hid the noise. He'd shoot at the floorboards near my feet. He liked the smell of the gunpowder in the house. He said it reminded me who was in charge. The silence in the study grew heavy, save for the rain lashing against the glass. He hit me for 4 years, Cora continued, her voice incredibly quiet, stripping away the last of her pride. He broke my collarbone twice. I learned to read his moods by the way his boots sounded on the porch. When the fever finally took him, the town preacher told me it was a tragedy. But Silas, I stood over his grave, and the only thing I felt was relief. I promised myself I would never, ever let another man have the power to make me flinch. Silas stepped closer. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid grounding force in the room. It wasn't a tragedy that he died, Cora, Silas said, his voice a low, fierce rumble of absolute conviction. The tragedy was that he lived long enough to put that fear in your eyes. Cora looked up at him. How do you do it? How do you carry so much death and still stand so tall? Silas's jaw clenched. He looked away, staring into the dying embers in the fireplace. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, the words seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul. My wife's name was Sarah, he said, his voice breaking on the syllable. My boy was Thomas. He was 4, just a year younger than Lily. Cora's breath hitched. She took a step toward him. It was a cholera outbreak, Silas continued, his eyes glazing over with a horrific memory. I was already wealthy. I owned half the valley, I hired 3 doctors, I bought every medicine they asked for, but all the money in the world couldn't stop them from bleeding out their own fluids. I held Thomas in my arms while he convulsed. I held Sarah's hand until it went cold. I had built an empire, Cora, and it was absolutely worthless. He turned back to her, his slate-gray eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I didn't stand tall after that. I died with them. I turned my heart into a stone because I couldn't survive the pain of losing anything else. I built higher walls. I became the ruthless bastard everyone thought I was. Because if people fear you, they don't ask you to care about them. Silas closed the distance between them, stopping mere inches away. And then you showed up on my porch, bleeding and half dead, risking your life for a man who had turned you away. You brought that little girl into this house, and she asked me to carve her a wooden pony. He raised his right hand, his calloused, scarred fingers trembling slightly as he gently cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized she shed. You brought me back to life, Cora, he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. You and Lily, you made me want to care again. And that terrifies me more than any bullet. Cora looked up at the man she had thought was a monster. He wasn't a monster, he was just a man who loved so deeply it had nearly destroyed him. Silas, she breathed, leaning her face into the warmth of his palm. He didn't hesitate anymore. Silas lowered his head and his lips met hers. It wasn't a forceful, demanding kiss. It was incredibly slow, almost reverent. It was the desperate collision of 2 starving, broken souls realizing they had finally found sanctuary. Cora let out a soft, shuddering breath, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his shirt. Silas groaned, a deep, primal sound in the back of his throat. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, lifting her slightly off her feet. The kiss deepened, the hesitant reverence exploding into a white-hot, consuming passion. For Cora, there was no fear, no flinching, no shadow of Elias's cruelty. There was only the heat of Silas's mouth, the taste of whiskey and rain, and the absolute terrifying certainty that she was entirely, hopelessly in love with him. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. "I've got you," Silas whispered fiercely into her hair. "Whatever Croft tries to do, whatever hell he brings to this valley, I swear to God, Cora, I will not let him touch you." Cora closed her eyes, holding on to him tighter. The storm raged outside, but inside Silas Vance's arms, the world was perfectly, beautifully quiet. The quiet didn't last. 2 mornings later, the brittle peace of the Vance estate was shattered by the thunder of approaching hooves. Bass burst through the heavy oak doors of the mansion, his scarred face grim, a Winchester repeater clutched in his massive fist. "Boss!" Bass bellowed, his voice echoing up the grand staircase. Silas emerged from his study, buttoning his waistcoat, his revolver already strapped to his hip. Cora was right behind him, a dish towel still in her hands from the kitchen. "What is it?" Silas demanded. "It's Sheriff Miller," Bass reported, practically spitting the name. "He's at the main gate with 6 deputies, and he ain't alone. Harlan Croft is sitting in a buggy right behind him." Silas's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "Did they breach the gate?" "No. I got 10 boys with rifles trained on their chests. But Miller is waving a piece of paper. Says it's a federal warrant. Says he's here for the widow." The dish towel slipped from Cora's numb fingers, dropping to the floor. The color drained entirely from her face. "A warrant? For what?" Silas didn't answer her. He turned to Bass. "Keep her inside. Do not let her step foot on that porch." He strode out the front doors, the heavy wood slamming shut behind him. Cora ignored Bass's outstretched arm and rushed to the parlor window, peering through the glass. Down at the wrought iron perimeter gate, Silas stood like a boulder in the driveway, completely unbothered by the 6 deputies pointing repeating rifles at him. Sheriff Miller sat atop his horse, looking sweaty and nervous. Behind him, in a pristine black buggy, sat Harlan Croft. Croft was a remarkably handsome man in his 40s, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, a silver-tipped cane resting between his knees. He looked like a civilized banker, which made the rot inside him all the more horrifying. "You're trespassing, Miller," Silas's voice boomed across the yard, carrying easily to the window. "I'm executing the law, Vance," Miller shot back, though his horse danced nervously. He held up a rolled parchment with a heavy red wax seal. "I have a federally expedited warrant from the state of Missouri for the arrest of one Cora Bennett. Charges are murder in the 1st degree." Inside the parlor, Cora gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Murder." "You're a long way from Missouri, Sheriff," Silas replied coldly. "And Elias Bennett died of a fever. The whole county knows it." "Not according to the new witness testimonies," Croft called out from his buggy, his voice dripping with smooth, venomous charm. He leaned forward, smiling like a predator. It seems several neighbors recalled Mrs. Bennett purchasing a rather large quantity of rat poison a week before her husband's fever took him. They've sworn affidavits. The Missouri magistrate found them highly compelling. "You paid them," Silas growled, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "You fabricated the whole damn thing." "I am merely a concerned citizen assisting the law," Croft smiled smoothly. "Now, Silas, we both know how this plays out. You interfere with a federal warrant, you lose this estate, your cattle, and your freedom. Hand the woman over. They hang her in Missouri, and the state takes custody of the child. It's a tragedy, really. An orphanage is a hard place for a little girl." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Croft wasn't just coming for her land anymore, he was threatening to destroy Lily. "Or," Croft continued, his voice softening into a reasonable purr, "Mrs. Bennett could sign her property over to my development firm this afternoon. If she were to do that, well, I might be inclined to hire better investigators. I imagine those witnesses in Missouri might suddenly remember things differently. The charges could disappear by morning." It was extortion. Pure, elegant, and legally binding extortion. Silas drew his revolver. The metallic snick of the hammer cocking was terrifyingly loud. The 6 deputies instantly raised their rifles to their shoulders. "Get off my land, Harlan," Silas said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "Before I put a bullet through your silver tongue." Croft's smile vanished, his eyes hardening. "You have until sundown, Silas. At dusk I come back with 20 men and a battering ram. And if a single shot is fired at a lawman, the U.S. cavalry will burn this house to the foundation." Croft signaled to the driver. The buggy turned around, Sheriff Miller and his deputies backing away slowly until they were out of range. Silas holstered his gun and walked back into the house. He found Cora standing in the foyer, trembling so violently she looked like she might shatter. "He's going to hang me," she whispered, the terror raw and absolute. "He bought the witnesses. He bought the judge. He's going to take my daughter." "No, he isn't." Silas grabbed her shoulders, his grip firm and anchoring. "Listen to me. I have cash in the safe. I have gold. We will ride to Austin tonight. I will hire the best legal defense in the country. I will buy the governor if I have to. I will liquidate every head of cattle on this ranch to keep you out of that noose." "And then what?" Cora cried, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "He takes your empire. He drains the aquifer. He ruins the entire valley, and you lose everything you've built." "I don't care about the empire," Silas roared, the raw, bleeding truth finally bursting out of him. "I care about you. I am not losing you, Cora. I am not digging another grave." The silence that followed was deafening. Silas was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a desperate, terrifying love. Cora stared at him. The urge to run, to hide behind his money and his guns, was overwhelming. It would be so easy to let Silas Vance play the savior. But she remembered the promise she made to herself over Elias's grave. She would never be a victim again. She would not let the man she loved destroy his life to save hers. She pulled a shaky breath into her lungs. She reached up and placed her hands flat against Silas's chest, feeling his racing heart. "We are not running," Cora said, her voice dropping the tremor replaced by cold, hard steel. "And you are not selling your soul to save me. We are going to fight him. Cora, he has the law in his pocket. We can't shoot our way out of a federal warrant." "We don't need to shoot," Cora said, her mind spinning with sudden, sharp clarity. "He said he bought the witnesses. He paid the judge. Harlan Croft doesn't do anything without keeping a record to use for blackmail later. Where does he keep his ledgers?" Silas blinked, thrown off by her sudden shift in demeanor. "He owns the bank in town. He has a private office on the 2nd floor. He keeps a Mosler iron safe behind his desk. But Cora, it's guarded day and night." "Not on Saturday night," Cora said, her eyes flashing. "Tomorrow is the spring charity ball at the town hall. The entire town will be there, including the bank guards. Croft will be there, parading around like a king." "You want to rob his safe?" Silas asked, disbelief warring with admiration. "It's a combination dial, Cora. We don't have the numbers." "I don't need the numbers." Cora stepped back, a fierce, defiant smirk touching her lips. "When I first moved here, before I started ranching, I took whatever jobs I could get. I cleaned the bank for 6 months. I know every creak in the floorboards. I know where the blind spots are. And I know the bank manager writes the safe combinations on the bottom drawer of his desk because he drinks too much and forgets them." Silas stared at her, awe washing over his hardened features. He had thought he was protecting a fragile bird. He had actually taken in a hawk. "If we get that ledger," Silas realized, the strategy forming in his mind, "it's physical proof of bribery, extortion, and judicial tampering. We bypass the local sheriff entirely. I know the U.S. Marshal in Austin personally. He's an incorruptible son of a bitch. If we hand him that book, he'll arrest Croft for federal racketeering." "And the warrant against me disappears," Cora finished. "It's incredibly dangerous," Silas warned her. "If Croft catches you in that office—" "He won't catch me," Cora said, her hazel eyes locking onto his. "Because you are going to be downstairs at the charity ball wearing your best suit, asking him for a dance. You're going to keep his eyes on you, Silas, while I take back my life." Silas looked at the woman standing before him. She was brilliant, fearless, and absolutely beautiful. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "All right, Mrs. Bennet. Let's go steal a ledger." The Copper Springs Town Hall was ablaze with light, a glittering beacon of civilization set against the wild, untamed dark of the Texas frontier. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over swirling silk dresses and tailored broadcloth suits. The town's elite had gathered for the spring charity ball, drinking imported champagne and pretending the dirt and blood of the cattle trails were 1,000 miles away. Silas Vance and Cora Bennett did not sneak in through the back. They walked through the front doors and the entire ballroom went dead silent. Cora looked breathtaking. Silas had sent a rider to Austin 2 days prior, returning with a gown of deep midnight blue velvet. It clung to her waist and swept elegantly across the floor, the high lace collar concealing the fresh bandage on her shoulder. Her golden brown hair was pinned up, exposing the long, graceful curve of her neck. She didn't look like a destitute widow, and she certainly didn't look like a woman running from a murder warrant. She looked like a queen. Silas stood beside her, a towering wall of broad shoulders in a pristine black tuxedo. He offered her his arm. Cora looped her hand through it, feeling the solid, reassuring muscle beneath the fine wool. "You ready for this?" Silas murmured, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "I've survived worse than a room full of hypocrites," Cora whispered back, her hazel eyes scanning the crowd. "Where is he?" "By the punch bowl, holding court." Silas's slate-gray eyes locked onto Harlan Croft. The banker was dressed impeccably, smiling as he charmed the mayor's wife. "Remember the plan. I keep his eyes on me. You have exactly 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Cora confirmed. She squeezed his arm once, a silent promise, and released him. Silas waded directly into the crowd, parting the sea of socialites like a battleship. Cora slipped away along the perimeter, moving gracefully toward the rear exit that led to the adjoining alley. Silas reached Croft just as the waltz music swelled again. "Harlan," Silas said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. Croft's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went flat and cold. "Silas, I'm surprised to see you here. I assumed you'd be busy packing your bags or digging a trench. Tomorrow is the deadline, after all." "I'm here to negotiate," Silas lied smoothly, picking up a glass of bourbon from a passing tray. "You want the Bennett land. I want the woman. Name your price, Harlan. I'll write you a draft from the Fort Worth exchange tonight." Croft's eyebrows arched in genuine surprise. The bait was taken. The idea that he had broken the great Silas Vance, forcing him to his knees to buy a woman's life, was an aphrodisiac to a narcissist like Croft. "Well now," Croft purred, gesturing toward a quiet alcove near the poker tables. "Let us discuss the market value of a beautiful widow." Outside in the alley, the cold night air bit at Cora's exposed cheeks. She hiked up the heavy velvet skirts of her gown, tying the fabric into a clumsy knot at her thigh so she could move. The bank was immediately adjacent to the town hall, sharing a brick wall. Cora didn't go to the front door. It was heavily padlocked and guarded by a deputy sitting on the boardwalk. Instead, she climbed the wrought iron fire escape in the alley. The metal rungs bit into her soft leather dancing shoes, but she didn't slow down. She reached the second-floor landing and pulled a thin steel hairpin from her updo. It took her 40 seconds to pick the lock of the bank's rear balcony door. The mechanism clicked, and she slipped inside. The bank was pitch black, smelling of ink, stale cigar smoke, and floor wax. The muffled, rhythmic strains of the waltz thumped through the shared brick wall, a surreal soundtrack to a felony. She crept down the carpeted hallway to Croft's private office. The door was unlocked. Inside, moonlight filtered through the heavy velvet drapes, illuminating the massive Mosler iron safe sitting flush against the oak wainscoting. Cora moved behind the bank manager's desk. "Please be a drunk," she prayed silently. She pulled the heavy bottom drawer out entirely, flipping it over in the dark. She ran her fingers along the rough wood of the underside until she felt the faint, carved indentations. She pulled a match from the desk caddy, striking it against her shoe. The brief flare of sulfur illuminated the carved numbers. 14, 32, 7. She blew the match out, dropping to her knees before the iron beast. Her heart was hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. She pressed her ear to the cold metal of the safe and gripped the brass dial. Click, click, click. 14 right. Click, click. 32 left. Click. 7 right. She grabbed the heavy iron lever and pulled. The locking bolts retracted with a heavy metallic thunk, and the door swung open. Inside lay stacks of greenbacks and gold certificates, but Cora ignored the fortune. She reached into the back compartment and pulled out a thick, black, leather-bound ledger. She opened it, tilting the pages toward the moonlight. Sheriff Miller, $500. Foreclosure enforcement. Judge Harrison, $1,200. Favorable ruling on Vance property dispute. Witness affidavits, Missouri, $800, paid to E. Higgins. It was all there, the blueprint of a monster. Downstairs in the town hall, Silas was casually swirling his bourbon, listening to Croft demand an astronomical sum for the deed. Silas checked his pocket watch, 19 minutes. You see, Silas, Croft sneered, leaning back in his velvet chair. It's not just about the land anymore. It's about the principle. You made a mockery of my authority. I think I'll take your money, and then I'll let the Missouri warrant execute anyway. Silas didn't blink. You're a greedy son of a bitch, Harlan. Croft chuckled. Greed is just ambition with the dust brushed off. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the ballroom. Speaking of the widow, where did she run off to? I haven't seen her in 20 minutes. Silas's blood went ice cold. He adjusted his stance, ready to draw. She went to the powder room. Croft's gaze snapped from Silas to the shared wall of the bank. His sociopathic mind connected the dots with terrifying speed. You're not negotiating, Croft breathed, his face draining of color. You're stalling. Croft vaulted out of his chair, shoving a waiter aside as he sprinted for the rear exit. Silas threw his glass to the floor and charged after him, drawing his Colt .45. Pandemonium erupted in the ballroom as women screamed and men scrambled away from the armed cattle baron. Upstairs in the dark office, Cora shoved the heavy ledger into the bodice of her gown, zipping her velvet jacket tightly over it. She pushed the safe door shut. The office door burst open. Harlan Croft stood in the threshold, his chest heaving. A silver-plated derringer pointed directly at Cora's chest. You thieving little bitch, Croft snarled, stepping into the room and kicking the door shut behind him. I should have let Elias beat you to death. Cora backed up against the desk, her hands raised. It's over, Harlan. I have the ledger. You have nothing, Croft hissed, cocking the derringer. I'll shoot you where you stand, tell the sheriff you were robbing my bank, and hang Silas Vance as your accomplice. Before Croft could pull the trigger, the stained-glass transom window above the office door shattered inward. Silas kicked the door with the force of a battering ram, ripping the frame entirely out of the wall. He dove into the room, his Colt roaring in the confined space. He didn't aim for Croft. He aimed for the heavy gas chandelier hanging directly above the banker. The bullet snapped the iron chain. The massive brass fixture crashed down, striking Croft's shoulder and sending his derringer skittering across the floor. Cora, the window! Silas roared. Cora didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy brass paperweight from the desk and hurled it through the plate glass window overlooking the alley. The glass exploded outward in a shower of glittering shards. She scrambled over the sill, tearing her velvet dress, and dropped onto the roof of the adjacent livery stable. Silas vaulted through the broken window right behind her, just as Sheriff Miller and 3 deputies burst into the office, rifles raised. Bullets chewed through the wooden window frame, showering Silas and Cora in splinters. They slid down the slanted roof of the livery, dropping into the muddy alley below. Bass was waiting. He held the reins of 2 massive saddled thoroughbreds. Got the marshal's wire, Bass shouted over the chaos. Crawford is riding in from the North Ridge, 10 miles out. Mount up, Silas yelled, tossing Cora up into the saddle of the roan before swinging onto his own black stallion. Above them, Croft leaned out the shattered window, his face twisted in absolute murderous rage. "Miller, get the posse! I want them dead! I want them both dead!" Silas kicked his horse into a brutal gallop. Cora rode hard beside him, the heavy black ledger pressed against her beating heart. They tore out of the alley, leaving the glittering lights of the charity ball behind, plunging headlong into the deadly pitch-black expanse of the Texas frontier. The moonlight washed the rocky badlands in a ghostly silver pallor. Silas and Cora rode at a breakneck, punishing pace, their horses lathered in sweat and foam. The wind screamed in Cora's ears, whipping her unpinned hair into her eyes. Behind them, a mile back but closing fast, was a trail of dust and the flickering orange glow of torches. Harlan Croft and Sheriff Miller had rallied a posse of 20 men. "Keep your head down," Silas bellowed over the thunder of hooves, his dark eyes scanning the treacherous terrain. They were heading north, pushing toward the jagged, yawning abyss of Dead Man's Canyon. It was the only rendezvous point Bass had managed to wire to Marshal Crawford. If they could hold the high ground until the federal lawmen arrived, they would survive. If Croft caught them before the marshal did, they would be buried in the desert. A rifle cracked in the distance. The bullet whined past Cora's ear like an angry hornet, burying itself into the trunk of a dead mesquite tree. "They have long guns," Silas shouted. "Cut toward the ridge. We need the rocks for cover." Cora yanked the reins, her horse scrambling up the steep, shale-covered incline. The terrain was brutal, slowing them down. The posse was gaining. Through the darkness, Cora could hear the frantic whinnying of horses and the harsh shouts of men out for blood. They crested the ridge. The ground leveled out for 100 yards before ending abruptly at the sheer 500-foot drop of the canyon. There was nowhere left to run. "Dismount," Silas ordered, pulling his Winchester from its scabbard as he slid off his stallion. He slapped the horse's rump, sending the animal away from the impending crossfire. Cora did the same, dropping behind a massive, waist-high boulder. She pulled the black ledger from her ruined velvet dress, clutching it to her chest. Her hands were shaking violently. The sound of the approaching horses triggered a tidal wave of panic, threatening to pull her under. Silas dropped to one knee beside her. He racked the lever of his Winchester, chambering around. He looked at Cora, his slate-gray eyes piercing through the darkness, finding hers. "I've got you," he said, the promise absolute. "No matter what happens, do not let go of that book." Before Cora could answer, Croft's posse crested the ridge. It wasn't just riders. Harlan Croft was driving a lightweight, two-horse buckboard wagon, whipping the animals into a frenzy. Sheriff Miller rode beside him, lifting a repeating rifle to his shoulder. "There they are," Miller roared. "Fire!" The night erupted into a deafening, terrifying cacophony of violence. Bullets sparked against the boulder, hiding Cora and Silas, sending razor-sharp chips of rock flying into the air. Silas didn't flinch. He leaned around the rock, his Winchester barking 3 times in rapid succession. 2 of Miller's deputies pitched backward off their saddles, hitting the dirt hard. "Fan out! Pin him down!" Croft screamed from the wagon, pulling a scattergun from beneath his seat. Silas was a maestro of violence, keeping the posse at bay with deadly suppressing fire. But there were too many of them. The sheer volume of lead pouring into their position was overwhelming. Sheriff Miller spurred his horse, flanking them to the left to get a clear angle behind the boulder. Silas saw the maneuver. He knew if Miller got the angle, Cora would be entirely exposed. "Stay down! Stay!" Silas roared. Abandoning his cover, Silas stepped out into the open moonlight. He leveled his rifle at Miller, pulling the trigger. The bullet took the corrupt sheriff dead in the chest, knocking him clean off his horse, but Silas's exposure was exactly what Croft had been waiting for. From the wagon, Croft raised his double-barreled scattergun and fired. The booming blast echoed off the canyon walls. Silas jerked violently, as if he had been kicked by a mule. The Winchester slipped from his hands, clattering against the rocks. He took one staggering, agonizing step backward, blood instantly blooming across the upper right side of his chest, soaking his white tuxedo shirt in crimson. He fell hard, his broad back hitting the unforgiving earth. "Silas!" Cora's scream tore from her throat, raw and agonizing. Time seemed to fracture, slowing down to a horrific, crawling pace. The sound of the gunfire faded into a muffled underwater roar. Cora dropped the ledger. She scrambled out from behind the boulder, throwing herself onto the dirt beside him. Silas was gasping, his eyes wide with shock. Blood was bubbling between his fingers as he clutched his chest. "Cora," he wheezed, blood flecking his lips. "Run! Get to the canyon edge." "No!" Cora sobbed, pressing her hands frantically over his to stop the bleeding. The wound was high, near the collarbone, but the blood loss was catastrophic. "I am not leaving you. I am not letting you die." "Well, ain't this a romantic tragedy?" a cold voice sneered. Cora looked up. Harlan Croft had halted his wagon 20 yards away. The surviving deputies hung back, watching. Croft stepped down from the buckboard, breaking open his scattergun to load 2 fresh shells. He snapped the barrels back into place with a sickening click. He walked toward them slowly, savoring his victory. "I'm going to take my ledger, Cora," Croft said smoothly, "and then I'm going to blow a hole in that arrogant bastard's head right in front of you." Cora looked at Croft. She looked at the gun in his hands. For her entire life, firearms had been the instrument of her torture. They were the sound of Elias's drunken rage. They were the tools of men who believed power came from fear. Her deep psychological trauma screamed at her to cower, to beg, to curl into a ball and wait for the pain. But then she looked down at Silas. Silas, who had taken her in. Silas, who had carved a wooden pony for a fatherless little girl. Silas, who had just stepped into a hail of bullets because her life was worth more to him than his own. The fear evaporated. It burned away entirely, replaced by a white-hot maternal and fiercely romantic rage. Cora didn't beg. She let go of Silas's chest. Her hand shot out, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel barrel of Silas's fallen Winchester. She stood up. The midnight blue velvet of her dress was stained with mud and her lover's blood. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like an avenging angel. Croft paused, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his handsome face. "Put the gun down, little girl. You don't even know how to hold it." Cora didn't say a word. She moved with a frightening, fluid calm. She lifted the heavy rifle, bringing the stock flush to her shoulder. With a sharp, violent flick of her wrist, she worked the lever action, chambering around. The metallic clack rang out like a death toll. She aimed directly at the center of Croft's chest. Croft sneered, raising his scattergun. "You don't have the nerve." Cora pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her bad shoulder, but she didn't even flinch. The Winchester roared. She didn't aim for Croft's chest. She was a rancher's wife. She knew a scattergun had a wider spread than a rifle. If she shot him, his dying reflex might pull the trigger and hit Silas. Cora's bullet bypassed Croft entirely and struck the heavy iron lantern hanging directly above the wagon's team of horses. The lantern exploded, showering the terrified animals in burning kerosene. The horses shrieked, rearing up in a blind panic. They bolted forward, dragging the wagon violently to the right. The heavy wooden wheel caught Croft squarely in the back, throwing him face first into the dirt with a sickening crunch. The wagon careened over him, its rear axle shattering against a boulder before the horses tore off into the dark. Croft screamed, a high, pathetic sound of agony, as his leg was crushed under the splintering wood. His scattergun flew out of reach. The remaining deputies raised their rifles, ready to gun Cora down. "Drop him! Federal marshals!" A booming voice shattered the night. From the darkness behind the deputies, 24 riders crested the southern ridge. The moonlight caught the silver stars pinned to their dusters. Marshal William Crawford rode at the head of the column, a repeating shotgun aimed squarely at the remaining mercenaries. Bass rode right beside him, a feral grin on his scarred face. The deputies dropped their weapons instantly, throwing their hands into the air. Marshal Crawford rode up to the wreckage, looking down at the groaning, broken form of Harlan Croft, and then at the woman standing over him in a blood-soaked velvet gown, holding a Winchester. Cora didn't lower the rifle. She stared down at Croft, her hazel eyes completely devoid of mercy. "Ma'am," Marshal Crawford said gently, tipping his hat. "I believe you have something that belongs to the federal government. And I have a doctor in my posse who needs to look at that man on the ground." Cora took a shuddering breath. The adrenaline snapped. The heavy rifle slipped from her fingers, hitting the dirt. She turned and fell to her knees beside Silas. The estate doctor had already dismounted and was ripping Silas's shirt open, packing the chest wound with gauze. "Silas," Cora wept, pressing her forehead against his pale cheek. "Silas, stay with me, please." Silas's slate-gray eyes fluttered open. He looked incredibly weak, his skin like parchment, but a faint, arrogant smirk pulled at the corner of his blood-stained lips. He lifted a trembling hand, his fingers tangling weakly in her hair. You shot his wagon," Silas breathed, awe coloring his fading voice. "Remind me never to make you angry, Mrs. Bennet." Cora let out a wet, broken laugh, pressing a desperate kiss to his forehead. "You just stay alive, Silas Vance. You have a pony to finish carving." Silas's eyes drifted shut, a peaceful sigh escaping his lips as the darkness pulled him under, safe in the knowledge that the woman he loved didn't need a savior anymore. She was a force of nature all her own. Spring arrived in the Texas Valley not with a whisper, but with a triumphant shout of color. A month had passed since the violent night at the edge of Dead Man's Canyon. The brutal winter frosts had finally retreated, leaving behind a rolling sea of vibrant bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush that painted the rugged frontier in strokes of violet and crimson. The air smelled of sweetgrass, damp earth, and the sharp, clean scent of fresh-cut pine. Cora Bennett wiped a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her canvas work glove. She stood in the center of her property, watching a crew of men hoist the final heavy crossbeam into place on her brand-new barn. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't the sprawling, fortified stone estate of the Vance Empire. It was a modest, sturdy wooden barn built on the very land Harlan Croft had tried to steal from her, and she hadn't sold a single acre to build it. "Rafters are set, Mrs. Bennet," Bass called down from the roof, wiping his scarred brow with a bandana. "She'll hold through a hurricane now." "Thank you, Bass," Cora called back, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face. She felt a presence step up beside her before she even saw him. The familiar, comforting scent of leather, cedar, and clean sweat washed over her. Silas Vance stood shoulder to shoulder with her, his thumbs hooked loosely into his gun belt. He wasn't wearing his tailored broadcloth suits or his silk vests. He wore faded denim, a dusty work shirt rolled up at the sleeves, and a pair of scuffed boots. He moved with a slight, lingering stiffness, a reminder of the catastrophic scattergun wound that had nearly taken his life. And if the top button of his shirt were undone, one could see the edge of the jagged, angry red scar spanning his upper chest. He was alive, and to Cora, he had never looked more handsome. "They do good work," Silas noted, his slate-gray eyes scanning the new barn. "Though I still say you could have let me buy the lumber from the Austin mill instead of milling it yourself." Cora bumped her shoulder playfully against his uninjured arm. "And I still say I know how to swing a hammer, Silas Vance. I told you I pay my own debts." Silas chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated in his chest. "I'm learning not to argue with a woman who shoots the wheels off a moving wagon in the pitch dark." The memory of that night didn't carry the paralyzing terror it once had. It carried the weight of victory. Marshal Crawford had been true to his word. Harlan Croft, his legs shattered and his empire of extortion exposed by the Black Ledger, was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, awaiting a trial he could not buy his way out of. Sheriff Miller was dead, the corrupt deputies were in chains, and the Missouri warrant against Cora had been unceremoniously thrown in the fire by a federal judge. But the greatest victory of all wasn't the destruction of Harlan Croft. It was what lay beneath their boots. A loud metallic clanking drew their attention toward the center of the pasture. A towering iron windmill pump had been erected over the exact coordinates Silas had pulled from the geological map. Several neighboring ranchers, men whose faces were lined with years of drought and worry, stood around the base of the pump, watching with bated breath. Silas turned to Cora, offering his hand. Ready? Cora stripped off her work glove and took his hand, lacing her fingers securely through his. Let's do it. They walked together toward the iron pump. The ranchers parted respectfully, tipping their hats to Cora. There was no judgment in their eyes anymore, only profound gratitude. Silas stepped up to the heavy iron release wheel. He gripped it with both hands, straining slightly against the rust and the pressure, his biceps flexing under his shirt. With a loud, grinding groan, the valve opened. For a second, there was nothing but the hiss of escaping air. And then the water came. It burst from the iron pipe in a thick, roaring torrent of crystal-clear, freezing water, surging up from the subterranean aquifer that Croft had wanted to hoard for himself. It cascaded into the newly dug irrigation trenches, flowing fast and deep, branching out like veins across the dry, cracked earth. A cheer erupted from the ranchers. Men threw their hats into the air. Some fell to their knees, letting the cold water rush over their dusty hands. It was the lifeblood of the valley, and it was finally free. "We'll run the main trench down to the southern properties by the end of the week," Silas announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the natural authority of a leader, but completely devoid of the ruthless edge it once held. "There are no meters. There are no tolls. The water belongs to the valley." Cora watched the water soak into her barren soil. It wouldn't be barren much longer. By next spring, this land would be green and thriving. She looked at Silas, her heart swelling with an emotion so vast it threatened to spill over his tears. He could have claimed the water rights. He could have doubled his fortune. Instead, he was standing in the mud, giving it all away because she had asked him to. As the sun began to dip low toward the western horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of burnt orange, magenta, and bruised purple, the crowd dispersed, returning to their own lands to prepare for the coming water. The estate fell quiet, save for the sound of the wind through the pines and the rhythmic clop, clop, clop of small wooden hooves against the porch floorboards. Cora and Silas walked back to the cabin. Sitting on the top step was Lily. The 5-year-old was the picture of health. Her cheeks were rosy, her eyes bright and entirely devoid of the haunted fear she used to carry. In her hands was the finished wooden pony. Silas had sanded it perfectly smooth, carving a flowing mane and tail and staining it a warm, rich chestnut color. "Look, Mr. Silas," Lily beamed, holding the toy up as they approached. "He's jumping the canyon." Silas sat down heavily on the step beside her, wincing slightly as his chest pulled, but his smile was blinding. "That's a mighty fine jump, Miss Lily. You've got to be a brave rider to take a horse over a canyon like that." "I am brave," Lily said matter-of-factly. "Like Mama." Silas looked up, his slate-gray eyes catching Cora's. "Yes, you are. Just like your Mama." Lily suddenly scrambled to her feet, throwing her small arms around Silas's thick neck in a fierce, unprompted hug. "Thank you for my pony," she whispered into his collar. Silas froze for a fraction of a second, entirely unaccustomed to the pure, unfiltered affection of a child. Then, very gently, he wrapped his large arms around her, burying his face in her hair. He closed his eyes, and Cora saw the last lingering ghost of his grief finally leave his body, carried away on the evening breeze. "You're very welcome, little one," Silas murmured gruffly. Lily pulled away, entirely satisfied, and darted off to show Bass her galloping horse as the foreman packed up his tools. Silas stood up slowly, stepping onto the porch to stand beside Cora. They leaned against the wooden railing, watching the sunset bleed across the endless Texas horizon. "I originally had a different plan for today," Silas said quietly, his gaze fixed on the setting sun. Cora leaned her shoulder against his. "Oh? And what was that?" "I was going to wait until the barn was finished. Then I was going to pack all your things, put you and Lily in a carriage, and move you into the estate. I was going to give you the master suite, buy you silk dresses, and hire 10 guards to stand at the gates, so nothing could ever hurt you again." Cora smiled softly, looking down at her calloused hands. A gilded cage. Exactly, Silas agreed, turning his head to look at her. I thought that was how you protected something precious. You lock it away. But then I realized your whole life was a cage. Elias built one out of fear. Croft tried to build one out of debt. If I brought you to the mansion and wrapped you in silk, I'd just be building another one. He reached out, his rough, scarred fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, tucking a stray lock of golden brown hair behind her ear. You don't belong in a cage, Cora, Silas whispered, his voice incredibly tender. You belong out here, where the wind blows. You fought for this land. You bled for it. So, I'm not asking you to move into my world. Silas didn't drop to one knee. He didn't offer her a desperate plea for rescue or a demand for surrender. He simply turned to face her fully, standing tall, his slate-gray eyes burning with absolute, unwavering devotion. I'm asking if I can move into yours, Silas said. I don't want to rescue you, Cora Bennett. You don't need rescuing. I just want to stand right here, shoulder to shoulder with you, and fight whatever storms come our way. For the rest of my life. Cora's breath hitched. The tears she'd been holding back all day finally spilled over her lashes, tracing hot, shining paths down her cheeks. For 4 years, she had believed that love was a weapon used to control. But standing before Silas Vance, she knew the truth. Love wasn't a cage. Love was a wide-open horizon. She reached up, tangling her hands in the collar of his faded work shirt, and pulled him down to her. Yes, Cora breathed against his lips. Yes, Silas. Stand with me. He kissed her, a deep, consuming kiss that tasted of sweet grass, promises, and the absolute certainty of tomorrow. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, right over his beating heart, where she belonged. 2 days later, the morning sun broke clear and bright over the Texas ridge line. 3 figures rode silhouetted against the vast, brilliant blue of the western sky. Silas rode his massive black stallion, his posture relaxed, his dark eyes scanning the horizon not for threats, but for the sheer beauty of the land. Beside him rode Cora on her roan mare, sitting tall in the saddle. She didn't carry a gun, but she carried the fierce, quiet confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. And riding just ahead of them, laughing as the wind caught her hair, was Lily, perched proudly atop a gentle dapple-gray pony Silas had brought her from the estate. Cora watched her daughter ride, a profound peace settling deep into her bones. A month ago, she had ridden into a violent storm, terrified and bleeding, believing her fate was entirely out of her hands. She had thought her one desperate act of courage would be the end of her story. Instead, it had been the beginning. Silas guided his stallion closer to Cora's mare. He reached across the small gap between them, his large, scarred hand finding hers. Cora laced her fingers through his, squeezing tightly. They didn't ride toward a happily ever after. The frontier was still wild, the winters would still be hard, and life would always demand courage. But as they rode together over the crest of the ridge, chasing the endless horizon, Cora knew they weren't just surviving anymore. They were riding happily ever forward. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.